The disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux is a case that unsettled an entire community and continues to echo through the world of true crime. It is a story that begins with promise, ambition, and quiet routines, and slowly transforms into fear, unanswered questions, and a relentless search for truth. This is Dark Psyche Case Files, and today we examine the events that led to the disappearance of a young woman whose life was just beginning. Kelli Ann Bordeaux was known by friends and family as driven, disciplined, and deeply committed to her goals. She was a member of the United States Army, a profession that demands resilience, focus, and sacrifice. Those who knew her described her as independent and hardworking, someone who took pride in standing on her own and building a future through dedication rather than shortcuts. At the time of her disappearance, Kelli was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, one of the largest military installations in the world. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Kelli was living in a quiet neighborhood in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She had recently rented a small townhouse not far from the base, a place that represented independence and stability. It was a modest home, but it was hers. For Kelli, this was not just a residence. It was a symbol of progress, a step forward in adulthood and self-reliance. By all outward appearances, her life followed a predictable routine. She reported to duty, maintained her physical training, and kept in touch with friends and family. There were no known conflicts serious enough to raise concern, no dramatic public struggles, no warnings that something was about to go terribly wrong. On the evening before she vanished, Kelli followed what appeared to be an ordinary schedule. She returned home after her day, and there was nothing to suggest that it would be the last normal evening she would ever have. Later that night, neighbors reported seeing her at her residence. Lights were on. Her vehicle was parked outside. Everything looked exactly as it should. But by the following day, silence replaced routine. When Kelli failed to report for duty, alarms began to sound. In the military, unexcused absence is taken seriously, especially when it is uncharacteristic. Attempts were made to reach her, but there was no response. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were left, but none were returned. As concern grew, fellow service members and superiors realized this was not a simple case of oversleeping or miscommunication. A welfare check was requested at her home. When authorities arrived at Kelli's townhouse, they found a scene that raised immediate concern. Her vehicle was still parked outside. Personal belongings were inside. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, no immediate explanation. It was as if she had stepped out briefly and never returned. The absence of chaos was unsettling. Inside the home, investigators noted items that suggested Kelli had not planned to leave for long. Essentials remained behind. Nothing indicated that she had packed for a trip or intended to disappear. The environment did not match the idea of a voluntary departure. Instead, it hinted at interruption, something unexpected that had altered the course of her life without warning. As news of her disappearance spread, family members were notified and worry quickly turned into fear. Those closest to Kelli insisted that she would never vanish without contact. She was responsible. She understood duty. She valued communication. This behavior did not align with who she was. The local community began paying attention as well. Flyers appeared. Conversations started. Neighbors replayed memories, searching for anything unusual they might have overlooked. Every detail suddenly mattered. Unfamiliar vehicles, strange sounds, anything out of place. Law enforcement officially classified Kelli Bordeaux as a missing person, and the search began. Search teams combed nearby wooded areas, fields, and drainage zones. Canvassing efforts expanded through the neighborhood as investigators knocked on doors and asked residents about their movements during the critical hours. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses and intersections was reviewed, frame by frame, looking for even the smallest clue. But answers did not come easily. As days passed, the case gained wider attention. Media outlets began reporting on the disappearance of the young soldier who vanished without explanation. The image of Kelli in her military uniform circulated across television screens and online platforms, transforming her from a private individual into the face of a growing mystery. Speculation followed, as it often does. Some wondered whether she had encountered someone she trusted. Others questioned whether she had been targeted because of her routine. Investigators remained careful, emphasizing facts over theories, but the pressure to find answers intensified with every passing hour. What made the case particularly troubling was the lack of a clear starting point. There was no definitive moment where everything went wrong, no confirmed witness who saw her leave, no confirmed destination. The timeline blurred, and investigators were forced to reconstruct her final known movements piece by piece. Family members pleaded publicly for information, urging anyone who knew anything, no matter how small, to come forward. Friends spoke of her kindness and strength, reinforcing the belief that she would not simply walk away from her life. As the search continued, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever had happened to Kelli Bordeaux occurred swiftly and quietly, leaving behind questions that would haunt investigators and loved ones alike. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was the beginning of a true crime investigation that would uncover disturbing details, challenge assumptions, and leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. If you're finding this case compelling so far, remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button to stay with Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue uncovering the truth behind the disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux. As the search for Kelli Bordeaux moved into its next phase, investigators began shifting from immediate response to deeper analysis. The initial hope that she would be found nearby, confused or temporarily displaced, slowly faded. What remained was a troubling silence and a growing realization that this case would demand patience, precision, and persistence. Law enforcement expanded the scope of the investigation beyond Kelli's townhouse. Detectives began reconstructing her final confirmed movements, carefully reviewing everything known about her routine in the days leading up to her disappearance. Every phone call, every message, every interaction was examined for meaning. They were looking for anything that felt out of place, anything that suggested a break in her normal pattern. Kelli's phone records became a focal point. Investigators confirmed that her phone had gone quiet shortly after her disappearance. There was no activity that suggested travel, distress, or attempts to reach out for help. This absence of communication reinforced what her family had been saying from the beginning. Kelli would not choose silence. Silence had been forced upon her. Attention soon turned to her personal relationships. Friends, fellow soldiers, neighbors, and acquaintances were interviewed. Investigators were careful not to rush to conclusions, but they understood that disappearances rarely happen in isolation. Someone, somewhere, might have noticed something important. Neighbors were asked about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual noises, or strange encounters during the night and early morning hours surrounding her disappearance. Some recalled seeing cars they did not recognize. Others remembered hearing sounds that seemed ordinary at the time but unsettling in hindsight. Each statement was logged, analyzed, and cross-referenced, even when it led nowhere. The environment surrounding Kelli's residence raised additional questions. Her townhouse was located near wooded areas and undeveloped land. Search teams returned to these areas repeatedly, using trained personnel and volunteers to comb through dense terrain. The searches were methodical and emotionally exhausting. Hope clashed with fear as each area was cleared without answers. As the case gained national attention, the public became involved. Tips poured in from across the country. Some were sincere attempts to help, others were vague or unfounded. Investigators had to balance openness with caution, separating useful information from distraction. Every tip was considered, because even the smallest detail could unlock a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Kelli's family faced a different kind of struggle. Waiting became their daily reality. They gave interviews, held vigils, and spoke directly to the person or persons responsible, asking for mercy, honesty, and answers. Their messages were calm but filled with pain. They did not accuse, they pleaded. Within the military community, concern was equally strong. Fellow service members expressed disbelief that one of their own could vanish so completely. The discipline and accountability of military life made the disappearance even more alarming. Commanders cooperated fully with civilian authorities, providing records, schedules, and background information to assist the investigation. Despite the growing pressure, there was still no clear suspect. This absence of direction frustrated investigators and unsettled the public. Without signs of forced entry, without witnesses, and without immediate evidence of violence, the case sat at an uncomfortable crossroads between missing person and potential crime. Still, detectives continued forward, knowing that time could either erase evidence or reveal it. As days turned into weeks, the tone of the investigation subtly shifted. Hope was still present, but it was now paired with preparation for darker possibilities. Search strategies became broader. Behavioral analysts were consulted. Patterns from similar cases were studied, not to predict outcomes, but to avoid mistakes. Through it all, one question remained unanswered and ever-present. Who was the last person to see Kelli Bordeaux alive? That question would soon become central to everything that followed. If this case has your attention, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue uncovering the truth. As investigators worked through the expanding volume of information, they began to notice subtle but important patterns. Kelli's routine, once predictable, now appeared vulnerable when examined closely. Her daily movements, though ordinary, were consistent. She left for duty around the same time, returned home along familiar routes, and rarely deviated without informing someone she trusted. This predictability raised difficult questions about whether someone had been watching her. Detectives began analyzing the area around her residence more critically. The neighborhood, while generally quiet, allowed easy access in and out without drawing attention. The nearby wooded terrain provided cover, and the absence of surveillance cameras in key areas complicated efforts to track movement. It became increasingly clear that if a crime had occurred, it may have been planned rather than spontaneous. Investigators also reviewed reports of prior incidents in the area. There had been unrelated crimes nearby in the months before Kelli disappeared, but none that directly connected to her case. Still, nothing was dismissed. Detectives understood that patterns often emerge only after thorough comparison, and even seemingly unrelated details could later become significant. The pressure on law enforcement intensified as public interest grew. Media coverage expanded beyond local news, and Kelli's story reached a national audience. With that exposure came both support and scrutiny. Every decision made by investigators was now being watched, analyzed, and sometimes criticized. Despite this, the investigative team remained focused, careful not to let speculation dictate their actions. Behind the scenes, analysts worked to build a psychological profile of whoever might be responsible. They considered scenarios ranging from an opportunistic encounter to a calculated act by someone familiar with Kelli's habits. Each possibility carried its own implications, and none could be ruled out. Friends continued to come forward with memories, conversations, and small details that once seemed insignificant. A casual remark, a brief interaction, a feeling that something was off, even if they could not explain why. These recollections were emotionally difficult to share, but they were offered in the hope that they might help bring Kelli home. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was how quickly normal life had been disrupted. Kelli had gone from being a private individual to the center of a high-profile investigation in a matter of days. Her absence left a void not only in her family, but also within her unit and her community. The uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone involved. As the investigation moved forward, law enforcement prepared for the possibility that this case would require a long-term commitment. Resources were allocated accordingly. Leads were prioritized. Strategies were adjusted. The search for Kelli Bordeaux was no longer defined by urgency alone, but by endurance. And still, the central mystery remained intact. What happened to Kelli Bordeaux after she was last seen in her home? The answer to that question lay somewhere ahead, waiting to be uncovered. If you're following this case with us, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to stay connected with Dark Psyche Case Files. As the investigation entered its next stage, the focus narrowed from broad searches and public appeals to something far more specific: identifying the individuals who had crossed paths with Kelli Bordeaux in the final days and hours before she disappeared. Investigators understood that, while strangers could not be ruled out, the most critical answers often come from those closest to a victim's routine. Attention turned firmly to Kelli's personal life. Detectives confirmed that Kelli had been in a relationship prior to her disappearance. Like many young adults balancing career demands and personal connections, her private life was not without complexity. While there was no immediate evidence of conflict severe enough to predict violence, investigators knew that relationships can hide tensions not visible to outsiders. Interviews with friends and acquaintances revealed that Kelli had recently been navigating changes. She was adjusting to life in her new residence and managing the pressures of military service. Those close to her described her as resilient, but also acknowledged that she carried the stress typical of someone striving to maintain control over a demanding life. One name soon became central to the investigation. Kelli's former romantic partner was questioned extensively. Detectives examined his whereabouts during the critical timeframe surrounding her disappearance. His statements were compared against phone records, witness accounts, and timelines. At first glance, nothing definitively placed him at the scene during the moment Kelli vanished. Still, inconsistencies began to emerge, subtle enough to require closer examination rather than immediate conclusions. Investigators also reviewed digital communication. Messages, call logs, and electronic activity were analyzed for signs of distress, conflict, or planned meetings. While there was no direct message indicating danger, the absence of communication after a certain point stood out sharply. It reinforced the belief that Kelli's disappearance was abrupt and unplanned. Meanwhile, search efforts continued beyond Fayetteville. Areas surrounding Fort Bragg, remote wooded regions, and less traveled routes were examined with renewed focus. This phase of the search was more targeted, informed by behavioral analysis and developing theories. It was no longer about searching everywhere. It was about searching intelligently. The emotional toll on Kelli's family deepened as weeks passed without resolution. Hope persisted, but it was now accompanied by an unspoken fear. Public statements from law enforcement grew more cautious. Language shifted from optimism to realism, preparing the public for outcomes no one wanted to consider. Within investigative meetings, discussions became more direct. Detectives began operating under the assumption that Kelli had been the victim of a serious crime. This shift did not abandon hope, but it acknowledged probability. It allowed investigators to pursue leads that might otherwise remain unexplored. As evidence was reviewed and re-reviewed, one troubling realization took shape. Someone had likely taken advantage of Kelli's trust, routine, or familiarity. This was not an impulsive disappearance. It bore the signs of intent. And as the pressure mounted, investigators prepared to take decisive steps. Steps that would change the direction of the case forever. If you're staying with us through this unfolding story, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files. By the time the investigation reached this stage, The disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux had moved far beyond uncertainty and into something far more deliberate. Investigators were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. They were now working under the belief that Kelli had been taken, and that whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to avoid detection. The shift in mindset brought a change in tactics. Detectives intensified their focus on behavioral patterns, not just of Kelli, but of the people connected to her life. Every statement that had once seemed ordinary was now revisited with fresh scrutiny. Timelines were reconstructed repeatedly, sometimes down to the smallest window of time, as investigators searched for inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away as memory gaps. One individual continued to stand out. Kelli's former romantic partner remained a central figure in the investigation, not because of public speculation, but because of the accumulating weight of unanswered questions. Law enforcement examined his movements before, during, and after the time Kelli vanished. His account of events was compared against surveillance footage, cell phone location data, and witness observations. What troubled investigators was not a single glaring contradiction, but a pattern of explanations that did not fully align. Search warrants were obtained as probable cause strengthened. Properties connected to him were examined carefully. Vehicles were inspected. Electronic devices were analyzed. Each step was taken methodically, guided by evidence rather than assumption. Investigators knew that mistakes at this stage could compromise the entire case. At the same time, search efforts continued in remote areas. Law enforcement expanded outward into heavily wooded terrain, places that were difficult to access and easy to overlook. These searches were physically demanding and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Volunteers, soldiers, and professionals worked side by side, driven by a shared determination to find answers. As days turned into weeks, the reality of the situation became heavier. Public statements from investigators were cautious, but the language used privately was far more direct. They were preparing for the possibility that Kelli might not be found alive. This preparation did not mean surrender, it meant focus. Behind closed doors, evidence was beginning to tell a clearer story. Data from cell towers suggested movements that conflicted with earlier statements. Timelines narrowed, gaps closed. The margin for coincidence grew smaller. Meanwhile, Kelli's family continued to endure an unimaginable weight. Every update brought hope and fear in equal measure. They trusted the process, even as it stretched on longer than anyone had expected. Their belief that Kelli deserved justice never wavered. As investigators closed in, they understood that the next steps would define the case. Decisions made now would determine whether the truth could be proven beyond doubt. There would be no room for speculation, only facts. And those facts were beginning to converge. The investigation was approaching a turning point. If you're following this case with Dark Psyche Case Files, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. As the investigation pressed forward, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. What had once been a search driven by uncertainty was now guided by direction. Investigators were no longer casting wide nets. They were closing in. Evidence that had seemed fragmented in earlier weeks was now being examined as part of a larger picture. Digital records, movement patterns, and witness timelines began aligning in ways that reduced ambiguity. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion. Kelli Bordeaux had not disappeared by chance. Law enforcement intensified surveillance and monitoring efforts around the primary person of interest. Every action, every statement, every interaction was documented. Investigators were careful, fully aware that any misstep could jeopardize months of work. Patience became just as important as urgency. The role of technology proved critical. Location data placed individuals in areas they had not previously acknowledged being. Small windows of time, once dismissed as insignificant, now carried weight. Investigators understood that crimes are rarely revealed by dramatic evidence alone. More often, they are exposed through accumulation. Search efforts also shifted again, guided by this evolving understanding. Teams returned to wooded areas that had already been searched, this time with narrower focus and refined methods. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense vegetation, uneven ground, and limited visibility slowed progress. Yet no area was dismissed without thorough examination. During this period, investigators faced another challenge: managing public perception. Media attention had grown intense, and speculation threatened to overtake facts. Law enforcement remained deliberate in what they shared, refusing to confirm details prematurely. Their restraint was strategic, designed to protect the integrity of the case. Privately, however, discussions were growing more definitive. Investigators believed that Kelli had encountered someone she knew, someone familiar enough to avoid raising alarm. This belief shaped every subsequent decision. It explained the lack of forced entry. It explained the absence of immediate signs of struggle. It explained why her routine had worked against her. As this theory gained strength, the pressure on the person of interest increased. Interviews became more pointed. Inconsistencies were addressed directly. Silence replaced earlier explanations. Investigators noted changes in behavior, subtle but telling. Then came a breakthrough. Information surfaced that redirected search teams to a specific remote area. It was not a random location. It was chosen based on data, analysis, and probability. The search there was quiet, controlled, and heavy with expectation. Those involved understood the gravity of what they might find. When evidence was ultimately recovered, the case crossed a line from investigation into confirmation. The discovery was handled with care and respect. Notifications were made. Procedures were followed. For Kelli's family, the moment was devastating, even as it ended the unbearable uncertainty that had consumed their lives for so long. Truth, however painful, replaced not knowing. Law enforcement now moved decisively. The evidence gathered, both physical and digital, was assembled into a case that told a clear and compelling story. Motive, opportunity, and action converged. What had once been suspicion became accusation. An arrest followed. The announcement marked a turning point not just in the investigation, but in the emotional journey of everyone involved. For the community, it brought relief mixed with sorrow. For Kelli's family, it brought the beginning of a different kind of endurance, the pursuit of justice. Investigators emphasized that while an arrest had been made, the work was not finished. Accountability would now shift to the legal system. Evidence would be tested. Facts would be challenged. Truth would need to withstand scrutiny. But one thing was no longer in doubt. Kelli Bordeaux had been the victim of a calculated act, carried out by someone who had underestimated the power of persistence, evidence, and time. If you've stayed with us through this chapter, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to continue supporting Dark Psyche Case Files as we move toward the conclusion of this case. With an arrest made and the investigation entering the judicial phase, the case of Kelli Bordeaux moved into a new chapter, one defined not by searching, but by accountability. For law enforcement, this stage required the same level of precision and discipline that had guided the investigation from the beginning. Every conclusion would now be tested in court. Every detail would be scrutinized. The individual charged in connection with Kelli's death faced the full weight of the evidence that had been carefully assembled over time. Prosecutors worked closely with investigators to construct a clear and factual narrative, one that relied not on emotion, but on proof. Digital data, witness statements, and forensic findings were organized into a timeline that revealed how the crime had unfolded. In court proceedings, the focus turned to establishing intent and responsibility. The prosecution outlined how Kelli's routine had been known, how trust and familiarity had been exploited, and how deliberate actions had led to irreversible consequences. They emphasized that this was not an accident, nor a moment of confusion, but a series of choices made with awareness and purpose. For Kelli's family, attending hearings was both painful and necessary. Sitting in the same room as the person accused of ending her life required strength beyond measure. They listened as her final days were discussed in formal language, stripped of personal familiarity. Though the process was difficult, they remained present, determined to see justice through. Throughout the proceedings, Kelli was remembered not only as a victim, but as a person. Statements highlighted her dedication to service, her ambition, and her character. Those who spoke on her behalf described her as disciplined, kind, and focused on building a meaningful future. These reminders ensured that the case did not reduce her life to a single tragic outcome. The defense challenged the evidence as expected. Timelines were questioned. Interpretations were debated. This was the nature of the legal system, designed to test every claim. Still, the foundation of the case remained firm. The accumulation of facts left little room for doubt. As the trial progressed, public interest resurfaced. Media outlets revisited the case, recounting the investigation and its conclusions. For many, it was a reminder of how easily routine can be disrupted and how quickly ordinary life can turn into tragedy. For others, it reinforced the importance of persistence in the pursuit of truth. Beyond the courtroom, Kelli's case continued to resonate within the military and civilian communities alike. Discussions emerged about safety, awareness, and the vulnerability that can exist even in structured environments. While no policy could undo what had happened, her story prompted reflection and renewed commitment to vigilance. As testimony concluded and arguments were presented, the case approached its final judgment. The waiting, once again, tested the patience and strength of everyone involved. But this time, the uncertainty was different. The truth had been uncovered. What remained was resolution. Kelli Bordeaux's disappearance had begun as a mystery. It had become an investigation. Now it stood as a reminder of loss, of justice pursued, and of a life that deserved protection. If you've followed this case with us so far, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files as we move toward the conclusion of this story. As the legal process reached its conclusion, the weight of everything that had unfolded settled heavily on all who had followed Kelli Bordeaux's story from the beginning. What started as a disappearance marked by confusion and hope had ended in confirmation, accountability, and a permanent sense of loss. The courtroom became the final stage where the truth, long pursued, was formally acknowledged. When judgment was delivered, it did not bring celebration. There was no sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that justice, while necessary, could never restore what had been taken. For Kelli's family, the ruling marked the end of one painful journey and the beginning of another, one defined by remembrance rather than waiting. Statements made during sentencing reflected the gravity of the crime and the impact it had left behind. The court recognized not only the facts of the case, but the human cost. Kelli's absence was described as a void that could not be filled, a future erased before it could fully unfold. Her service, her discipline, and her determination were acknowledged as defining parts of who she was, not footnotes to her death. Outside the courtroom, reactions were subdued. Community members expressed relief that the truth had been brought to light, but sorrow that such an outcome had been necessary. The case had touched many lives, reminding people that danger does not always announce itself, and that familiarity can sometimes conceal intent. In the months that followed, Kelli's name continued to surface in conversations about safety, trust, and awareness. Her story became a point of reflection, especially for young people navigating independence and routine. While no lesson could undo the tragedy, her case served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the reality that even the most disciplined lives can be disrupted by the actions of others. For investigators, the case stood as a testament to persistence. It reinforced the value of patience, evidence-driven decisions, and refusing to abandon a search simply because answers are slow to emerge. Every lead followed, every detail examined, contributed to a resolution that once seemed unreachable. Kelli Bordeaux was more than a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a soldier, and a young woman with goals that extended far beyond the moment her life was taken. Remembering her means acknowledging all of that, not just how her story ended, but how it began. As Dark Psyche Case Files closes this chapter, we do so with respect for Kelli's life and for those who never stopped seeking the truth on her behalf. True crime stories often focus on mystery and investigation, but at their core they are about people, people whose lives mattered. If you've stayed with us through this entire case, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files and help keep these stories told with care, accuracy, and respect. This was the disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux.